So the question that for the whole region now is who's next, right? I'm going to jump a little bit. What I think Trump has established yesterday, leading up to yesterday, is like I could just make up a story about you, um, and then come for you, and no one's going to stop me.
Well, interestingly, there is a clip for the incident that I looked at yesterday. A former prime minister, sorry, former president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, stating, he is of the view that the United States is thinking of designating him a narco terrorist so that they could use their policies and so on in an effort to come up with a complete lie and then use that just so that they could take over Venezuelan oil, energy, and natural resources. That was stated by Hugo Chavez way back when. And it's interesting to see that as we come forward, the same stuff has happened. And why I like your who's next question is because this was essentially asked to President Trump yesterday when they said, okay, well, what about Colombia? Colombia's president has said that, he is not too concerned about Colombia and whatever. But what do you say, President Trump? And President Trump said in no uncertain terms that he needs to watch his ass. Now, this is right after the United States has captured and apparently dragged Maduro and his wife out of their beds and took them on and eventually took them to the United States, right? But with the support and help of the Colombians, right? Now, Nicolas Maduro had been telling the Colombians, listen, we need to unite because, they're coming for you next. Of course, the Colombians shrugged that off because they're working with the United States and trying to hamper down things so that, they could deal with the narco issues and whatever. But yesterday now, President Trump accused the Colombian president of being in control of cocaine mills, something that the Colombian president has said is complete fabrication. But he also happens to be somebody who is on the far left, right? And what did Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth and stuff say? We are engendering peace through strength, right? Peace through strength. Yep, that's the Colombian president, Petro. He has rejected flatly these accusations by President Trump. But it seems like he's next, right? Despite assisting the United States in their interdictions and whatnot, and trying to do what he can to change things to satisfy and temper things down, right? But we need to only look at yesterday's press briefing, of President Trump, and that is thing. But what it does is that it sets a dangerous precedent, right? And that is something that was stated by the UN yesterday following the capture of a sitting president. Now, that's also a violation of diplomatic law, international law, and so on. Yeah, so that's not Nicolas Maduro,
No,
but I
no, that's Canal from Cuba who accepted
yeah,
sharing the closeness with Venezuela, right?
absolutely. He commented that this was basically an aberration and that they need to release President Nicolas Maduro. The Russians have also said that they need to release Maduro immediately. That this is a breach of international law and stuff. But why it is dangerous is because it falls in the face of international. What about diplomatic immunity? What about all of these things? So can we now, if President Trump is traveling, can we now just grab his president? And of course we can't because the United States will not do that. But that's the precedent to set. And what does it say to Russia? What does it say to China? At the same time, the United States is telling Russia, leave Ukraine alone. It is their sovereignty and stuff like that. But now you are now saying that it's okay for you to violate all the things you're telling Russia it's wrong for Russia to do. But you've just done it in Venezuela. And now you're saying that you're going to take control of their government and stuff. So, okay, Putin and President Xi from China are going to say, okay, well, thank you, US. You gave us the green light because we're going to do that with Taiwan. There's nothing you can say because you just did it in Venezuela for their resources. Putin is going to say the same thing. Well, Ukraine was part of Russia's under USSR days, so that's just our territory and we're taking it back. There's nothing you could say because you just did it in Venezuela. So what is this notion about democracy and we're bringing democracy and we're fighting for the people and so on? But yet you released the former president of Honduras, who is one of the biggest narco trafficking, cocaine running presidents in the history of the Western Hemisphere, right? Locked up under the US government for narco trafficking, narco terrorism, and so on, right? You released him. So how do you do these things and then expect people to take you seriously when you say, oh, we did it because of narco terrorism, but you're releasing narco terrorists right up and down the place, right? Not just that, the multiple narco terrorists have been released under this president. So how do we take President Trump seriously? That's the question.
That's a good question. I think intellectually, most people don't take him seriously. If you listen to him yesterday, he was like reading at third grade level, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The script must have been, font 40 the way he was reading, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's the apparatus behind him that we have to take seriously, right? In the sense to say, it's not Trump himself going into these countries and extraditing people, but he has a powerful military apparatus that can do so.
Mm-hmm.
You look in the region. All he had to say is, "Hey, listen, I'm canceling the visas for Antigua and Dominica." Right? Suddenly, Antigua now is telling the Cuban doctors bye. Suddenly, Antigua now is saying, "Oh, we might accept some deportees from the United States." These are things that Gaston, who is one of the strongest leaders in the Eastern Caribbean, was vehemently against. But
Yeah.
now, because visas are being threatened, everybody's falling in line, right?
Mm-hmm.
They asked Grenada to put a radar there, and someone who Deacon Mitchell, he couldn't even answer the people, have you agreed or have you haven't agreed, right? Okay, eventually radar went to Tobago. But my point is that this is the fear factor that Caribbean leaders have, not Trump himself, but the apparatus that Trump has access to, whether it's using the lever of military intervention or the lever of that visa denial. This is where we're at, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I know what's straight away from the impact of Trinidad
No, this is all
region,
contextual.
right? But when you have someone who of your prime minister's stature basically lambasted the rest of the region, right? Castigated us as if we're nobodies in favor of Trump, or to curry favor with Trump, pun intended, right? Then that tells you we're in a dangerous place as a region. We are in a. Let's say Trump tells let's say tells the same way he told Machado, nah, you're not capable. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
Trump says, no, that's all right. We'll refine our own gas because it's ours now, and we'll sell it to you. What
Mm-hmm.
what what is your prime minister gonna say then?
Or even still, what if they don't even consider Trinidad to be at all, right?
Yeah, what
And
is
this
he
is,
gonna say?
but also, um, but people are of the belief that the government has changed in Venezuela and everything is hunky dory and everything is peaceful. But actually, Maduro's government is still in power, right? I just need to make that clear. Maduro's government has not been ousted. They still remain in power, and they indicated yesterday through their vice president, who also streamed on the Facebook page of Nicolas Maduro after his capture, to say that the state continues to have its president as Nicolas Maduro. So while the US media and everybody is saying the former president of Venezuela, Venezuela says that um, Maduro is still their president and there has been no change. Now, I know that um, President Trump in his press briefing yesterday said, oh, he heard that Delcy has become the president. She said that's nonsense, that Maduro still remains the president of Venezuela and that they will be things. So there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation coming out of Washington, right? But why it's important, what you mentioned about, the people behind President Trump, is that it's important to understand that this has been a consolidation of hard right policy under Trump, right? He often mentions it, and I mentioned it months ago, that this is the re-engineering of the Monroe Doctrine, which falls under the Trump 2025 project, which he's often distanced himself from, but everything that has happened since meets with that. And I'm writing an article at the moment, which I'll be publishing soon, which identifies how that Trump 2025 project has it got its way, influenced its way into the Caribbean, and have funded political elements in the country. I will speak to that when I release that. But Trump's second term posture, Chris, has been one of policy consolidation, right? We're looking at the key features that include, a security first policy. When somebody asked Trump yesterday in the meeting, oh, well, Trump, how is taking over Venezuela and running their government an America first policy? He said, well, actually it is, because, all of this energy and stuff, we can get our oil companies down there to control it and stuff. It's about asset control over diplomacy, having control and influence, significant influence over their neighbors. Because in the Western Hemisphere, the US is supposed to, according to the Monroe Doctrine, be the overarching influence. And it has nothing about independence and sovereignty and stuff when it comes to that. Because President Trump said it himself, we can get people to fall in line, right? And he invoked visas, he invoked all these things, and it's about peace through strength. I want your viewing and listening public to go and just type in peace through strength. You can either type in Trump or Hegseth and just look at the material that come up and read it, right? The issue of migration has been treated, just largely migration has been treated as a threat vector. Of course, migrants and stuff have been the backbone of establishing the United States as the formidable power it is today. But that threat vector, I'm just talking about migration as a whole, okay? Not illegal migration, but migration as a whole has been turned into a threat vector by the Trump administration. And so they're using these things and even coming down harshly on their own citizens with all the ICE detentions and so on, racialized, positions, taking on hardline positions, and even deporting some of their own citizens who they've had to bring back, right? Things that have been ruled unconstitutional, overpowering the judicial element, not abiding by court rules, overextending presidential powers, not listening to Congress, not abiding by Congress's decision, even though it is required by law. But the United States, particularly because of the influence of the Trump-appointed judges on the Supreme Court, have been making this president into somewhat of a king, okay? And because of this kingmaker type of position, the United States is becoming more of a pariah in the region. And my concern is that they're doing more long-term damage to US foreign policy and US credibility and US influence in the region, which will redound to forces and nationalized forces building up and emanating even stronger. And that has the result of creating insurgencies in the region. Because what do we need to pay careful note of? Well, one, the fact that President Trump said that the Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro is funded and supported by Hezbollah, the IRGC out of Iran, all of these other quote-unquote terrorist organizations, that you've just undermined one of their key players in the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, right? Do you think they're going to leave it that hard, And then when, of course, a reporter asked President Trump yesterday in the press briefing, so what about Russia and so on, and China? He more so flippantly disregarded China. But then when he was asked about Russia and Putin, what Putin would say about, the energy and stuff, President Trump, interestingly, and I want people to go back to that interview, said, "Oh well, we'll have to see with Putin." So there's always with President Putin, there's always this interesting way that President Trump responds. He's not as forceful. It's more of like a negotiating position. Um, but of course, like I said, the action taken by President Trump yesterday now gives a green light to China on Taiwan. No holds barred, no rules, no international law required because the precedent has been set. For Russia on Ukraine, no rules, no need to listen to anything the EU has to say because they said nothing when President Trump violated Venezuelan sovereignty, breached international law, killed folks in the Caribbean with boat strikes, and also went in against congressional authority because it has to go through Congress for approval for any kind of war actions and so on. And took a sitting president of a country who, they accused of narco trafficking and whatnot. So this is the thing. So what we've seen is an ideology that national sovereignties in the region should be designed for U.S. interests, right? And there's it's conditional sovereignty for others. Okay, and so we've seen that with the invocation of course, the radar in Tobago, and then of course our prime minister threatening us, hey, don't bad talk the US, otherwise you might lose your visa. These things are absolutely remarkable. To even hear your own prime minister threatening you with the other country's visa, when in Africa, the flip thing has happened, right? Mali, Burkina Faso, and all that. Trump threatened them with visas, and they banned the Americans back. That for countries that are invoking their sovereignty and standing on principle and so on, give back the same thing. You understand? Give back the same thing. So there's a certain compliance is rewarded and resistance is punished, and of course the resistance that has emanated from Antigua and Barbuda, all of these countries that kind of gave some lip, it resulted in visa restrictions and travel restrictions and stuff like that, But I see you have, is that a video or a picture of Maduro's?
It's a picture of yesterday him being, as they say, perp walk at the DEA headquarters in New York City.
Well, this morning I actually published the video of him coming off the plane on my page, and so if you're able to get that and show the viewing public, that would be great. But what I want to do is in this particular time is tell people about Marco Rubio and why he is such a significant person in all of this. Now, he's a senior Republican policy figure, a long-standing hawk to Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Colombia, anywhere where there are left-leaning people who are, strong with the Cuban regime. He wants to get rid of that entire socialist agenda because of his political and historical background. He has deep ties to the Florida Cuban American political base, right? He's absolutely anti-left and anti-socialist. So policies that appear to be very socialist and to be more about giving citizens benefits and stuff like that, he is totally against. And so as a senior Republican, he thinks that Americans, citizens generally should pay for their own thing, and nobody should subsidize anybody's stuff at all because subsidies are an affront to the democratic principles of capitalism and so on and so forth, right? So his ideology shapes America's foreign policy as it relates to Latin American policy, Caribbean engagement, sanction strategy, and of course, regime pressure narratives, right? So it's interesting that as I say that, this is the backbone of the persons you spoke about earlier who are behind President Trump, who are advising President Trump, who are coming up with the policies that guide US foreign policy, right? And why this is quite critical is that, Rubio's core policy positions are primarily based around maximum pressure to ensure the toppling of regimes and individuals and prime ministers and presidents who prop up people like Nicolas Maduro, people like the Cuban regime, people like, the regime of Noriega in Nicaragua and so on, right? And Maduro in Venezuela. And as you know, the previous prime minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, followed very shortly by, of course, Stuart Young. They were fortifying relations with Venezuela's Maduro, who you see there in the video that you're going to play in a minute. That was an aversion to folks like Marco Rubio, right? And so what happened? Things happened behind the scenes. Dr. Rowley resigned as prime minister. Okay. There was a transition. Stuart Young then became prime minister. And famously, when Marco Rubio met with Stuart Young, he shook his hand and said, should I say condolences or should I say congratulations? And it then followed by one of the most crushing defeats that propelled Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar with her renewed, far-right style policies, which she didn't, have before in her first term, to victory with a constitutional majority. And the PNM had to say bye-bye because they got a condolences defeat. And so that wording was very interesting. Because, you're playing.
Yeah, sorry about that. Your mic.
Sorry, yeah. So that whole thing with Marco Rubio and the shift in Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar's tone and style and so on has been very, very interesting, because now we're seeing very Trumpian style decisions that you're getting rid of all of these subsidies, you're doing everything at once, you're passing legal notices while people are distracted with Christmas. And in the new year, on the very 1st of January, all of these prices are skyrocketing. Every single thing from passports to all of these things. But I need to mention something that happened just this morning in Venezuela, just before I continue on Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar's shift, is that yesterday, Venezuela's vice president refused to become the president and said that Nicolas Maduro remains the president of Venezuela. But this morning, Venezuela's Supreme Court said that Delcy Rodriguez has to become the interim president because the president is no longer, in the country due to whatever reason. So the Supreme Court has demanded that Delcy Rodriguez become the interim president of Venezuela. I think Delcy might have been trying to buy herself some time, in order to try to see how they can, manage this position. But it seems as though the Supreme Court of Venezuela isn't too happy with that and has ordered her to become the interim president of Venezuela. Right, so that is a piece of information that is coming out of Caracas this morning, and I thought that it would be very important for your viewing and listening public to understand that latest development. But yes, going back to Mrs. Prasad-Bissasa's shift in policies, it has become very, very, very interesting. Because from passports, everything going up 100%, some even 400% and more. Prices have gone up across the board, and all of this is happening all at once. Things have gone from 0 to 50, 0 to all sorts of numbers, right? And this is coming at a time where over 20,000 plus people have been sent on the breadline. The cost of living is exploding in Trinidad and Tobago, against the backdrop of our issues with energy. This is a political and social situation that is very close to being untenable.
So the question then becomes, let me drive a little bit into Trinidadian politics, right? How strong is your opposition to PNM?
Honestly speaking, I would say that the opposition in Trinidad and Tobago is not very strong. Respectfully to all the persons and so on, I think they need to be a lot stronger in terms of, the leadership needs to come out fighting more. A lot of the criticism of the current leader of the People's National Movement, Mrs. Penelope Beckles Robinson, is that she isn't, she isn't forceful enough. Things seem very watered down, right? And I think in order for the PNM to be taken seriously as a party, both in Trinidad and in Tobago, they need to just focus on the issues, come out strong and so on. I do note with interest that Mrs. Prasad-Bissassa, Mrs. Penelope Beckles Robinson came out to speak.
Any relation?
What do you say?
Any relation?
No relation. But there are lots of Robinsons in Trinidad and Tobago. But so she just needs to be a lot stronger. That's been often the criticism. She has come out. She does a lot of live streams, but I think the problem is that while they're talking, while they're using the social media platforms, it's not quick. It's not easy. The points are not easily grasped by the citizens, and because of that, people aren't aware of what the opposition is saying, because they're not going to sit down and watch a 2-hour live stream of questions to the opposition leader or what people are saying. So that all of these things need to be summarized in brief messages that are hard hitting. These things don't happen in the PNM, and it's often why they lose. Not just because the UNC often uses, and I don't want to give away what I'm going to be writing about soon, but often uses a lot of technology and political messaging to get their points across. The opposition PNM fails to do that.
Yeah, I mean the thing is, as you described, which I believe you 100%, you have mass job loss, mass unemployment, you have rising prices of food in a country that produces food.
Yep.
You have
imports.
As you reach Trinidad, or if you're leaving Trinidad, everybody's looking for doubles, but the doubles you all are getting are double tax, double fines, double this, and then you have a prime minister who's saying, "Well, if you behave yourself, I may reduce the fines I just doubled on you," right? And it sounds idiot. Let me just be diplomatic. It sounds very childlike, right? And
Yep.
it from a political view, it's fertile ground for an opposition to say this is what you have as a prime minister, and you need to have people out there. I don't want to say protesting, but mobilizing, right? Because not only in Trinidad do you not only have national election, you have local elections, right?
But you have to keep in mind that we are also under a state of emergency and have been since December 2024, right?
Mm.
We've been in a perpetual state of emergency since, notwithstanding that we've had significant murders taking place in the first part of the year, and we haven't even barely started yet, right? So, we have that aspect, and I don't think, protesting and stuff like that is going to be largely endorsed in a state of emergency, because in some senses it is a destabilizing type of situation. So there is a whole conversation to be had around why we're in a state of emergency. But I will give a hint. It started just prior, well, following the December 2024 signing of this new renewed status of the forces agreement with the United States. And then, of course, that agreement was, of course, ratified and extended and so on under Mrs. Prasad Misasa, which then resulted in all sorts of radars and other security um, arrangements and stuff taking place. And since then, we've been in a perpetual state of emergency. Perhaps the powers that be know why that is, but of course, part and parcel of that has been resulted in, the takeout of President Nicolas Maduro.
Well, what I would say, and I would say this, is that colonialism plays the long game, right?
Mm,
We in the Caribbean, we tend to think in election cycles. Well, what do we have to do to make sure I win the next election, or what do we have to do to ensure that we remain in power for the next election? You're thinking in this short 4 to 5 year cycle. When you are colonial power, irregardless of who I was
Leader.
the president or the prime minister, you're thinking long term, like, okay, how do I destabilize countries?
Mm,
Right? Because that's what we're seeing right now is the destabilization of the Caribbean, right? In the
mm,
sense to say, when you have an organizations that Caribbean nations are involved with actually going mute, right? That's
mm,
essentially what's happening right now is the old going mute. Oh, we are observing. You're
mm,
observing nothing more than what everybody else is seeing on CNN, right?
mm,
You're not getting any inside information. You're not getting any blies, right? The OAS, the CARICOM, the whoever, they're all saying we are observing,
yeah.
right? That's a very nice way of saying we're not getting involved because we don't want to get licked too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a very sad state because post 1950 we had movements, whether they be labor movements or political movements, that spoke against colonialism,
Mm, mm,
that spoke against white supremacy,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The Michael Mendes, the Bernard Forbes, right? Forbes Bernard from Guyana, the
Mm,
Chetty Jagans, right?
mm,
The Aon Robinsons.
correct.
I could go on. The Arab, the Barrows, the Birds, right? I could go on and on. But the point is, these people spoke up against injustice, right? We'll now reach a point where people, the leadership, is like, may not talk, right?
Mm, mm,
Right? Yeah, I'll bring something on, right? That's not what I mean. One second. something on where you had your prime minister had a lot of mouth to say prior to the prior to this invasion, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, yesterday she says, "Oh well, I'm not involved. I'm not involved." Right?
Mhm.
And you're like, hold on, wasn't you the same lady that said kill them all violently?
Yeah.
When you the old, same lady who said that Maduro's a corrupt regime and the CARICOM supports a corrupt regime?
Mhm.
Now suddenly you're saying you're not involved. What?
Now, interestingly, I think I'll ask a question to you,
Mm.
for your perspective, just to kind of course, you're an ambassador to been an ambassador to CARICOM, and so in that kind of with that lens on, how do you view this? Not necessarily speaking on behalf of your government, but more as an independent person. How do you view that, having had a lens in those spaces?
As a Caribbean person,
Yes.
I think we've become weak,
Mhm.
right? We've allowed ourselves. We're so dependent. Most of the Caribbean islands are now dependent on tourism. Used to be
Mhm.
agriculture, now it's tourism. You go back two generations. Most of our grandparents were either cotton sugar cane or some other agricultural or fishing products as
Mhm.
the mainstay, or they were emigrating out. We
Mhm.
now have in the Northern Caribbean, it's a lot of tourism, right?
Mhm.
Or financial services. In the Windward Islands, you have a lot of the OECS islands. You have a lot of citizenship by investment as the
Mhm.
mainstays of the economy. In Trinidad and Guyana and now Suriname, you have petro economies, right?
Mhm.
But each one of those are depending on whatever the U.S. allows. Because if the America says tomorrow that, listen, I'm designating whichever pick a country as a
Mhm.
terrorist state, and
Mhm.
Americans can no longer go there, that's the collapse of your tourism industry, right?
Absolutely.
If Trump says to your prime minister that no, you're not getting access to dragon gas, that's the collapse of your industry, your
Correct.
economy, right?
Correct. Correct.
If he says to the OECS countries, the five of them or six of them that do CBI, that your people can't come to America. No one with a passport from any OECS country participating in CBI can come to America. That's the collapse of the industry.
Correct.
So what happens when we're faced with being economically dependent on America? We then right, and I
Mhm.
think that's a shame as a black man that lived from the '60s onward. It's a shame.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, and then I would start there because I go back to the conversation that you said about the long game of colonialism that definitely has its mindset and political systems and structures deeply etched in not just some people's mindsets, but the systems that were left behind. Um, but I say that to say that why Caribbean people, in particular Trinbagonians, must understand the implications of what we've seen taking place yesterday is that there are parallels. There are parallels between the decisions taken under, you know, Hugo Chavez, for example, and of course the decisions by Dr. Eric Williams. They both viewed the imposition of foreign persons and influences over the uh, resources of the country as extracting too much. And they both nationalized operations to take control of their operations. They asserted state control over oil and resources. And because these foreign companies that they both thought were extracting too much and giving little to the people. And what did that do? It brought us to Trinidad and Tobago being the economic powerhouse of the region. Had that not occurred, we would not be in this position today. We would be largely, probably a British overseas territory in that ambit. right? But the reason I say that is because we have some people who, interestingly, are very much in favor of what took place. Now, we might say all sorts of things that, we agree or disagree with the regimes around us, but the way that we deal with that, it has to be in the context of international law. So if you are supporting that, right, I need Caribbean people to pay attention. If you're supporting what we saw took place, which is a breach of international law, a breach of the UN Charter, a breach of all sorts of rules in diplomatic relations and so on, if you're supporting that, then it's very easy for Trump to say tomorrow, you know what, I don't like Mrs. Prasad Bisesa. In fact, she's a narco-terrorist. Even though, the whole basis of this entire campaign in the region was about fentanyl, the United States the government released a report that says Venezuela has nothing to do with that, right? Fentanyl is from Mexico and Colombia and so on, and it uses the Eastern Pacific, right, waterway to get to the United States, not even the Caribbean, right? It uses that side. That's where it predominates into the United States. But never mind the facts, because when there is an agenda, the facts don't matter. And so if the facts don't matter, we are then saying that it is okay for Trump to get fed up a Kamala, accuse her of anything under the sun, and then come send up some troops in, take her out, parade her on so on, and then that's that. And that is why international relations, that's why there is a liberal international architecture that was designed to prevent this type of pariah kind of thing, dating back to colonialism, where you just want to take people's resources. So the long game that you spoke about is very, very interesting, because let's look at it. What has colonialism left behind, right? It has designed a system where, prior to, of course, the Caribbean forming into CARICOM, it was largely designing Caribbean nations to extract resources, right? Serve external powers, depend on foreign capital and security, right? By depending on that, you're constantly creating that dependent syndrome. So that even though, one or two people got their little political independence, what it did not remove, it didn't remove the system of external influence over trade. It didn't remove the system of external control over finance. It didn't remove the external leverage over security, which we depend upon, right? And so what happened? Small states ended up gaining flags and parliaments and little houses of assemblies, but remained embedded in a global power system, right? Which is the long game that you spoke about. Because even though from a face value, it changed, systematically, it hasn't, right? And so it's easy for folks to come in and say, you know what, whatever, let me just take that. You know what I mean? And so when Dr. Eric Williams, took the decisions that he did, including, various other decisions, the United States wanted to sanction him, wanted to do all the same things, because that's part of US foreign policy. So what does the long game look like? Because you spoke about the long game, and the long game, I view it as somewhat of a hard power political strategy, right? And what is that? What does that mean? Well, colonialism has now morphed into white supremacy, Monroe Doctrine, under President Trump. And what does that look like? It's rephrased as peace through strength. And that is exercised through a number of things. Trade access, okay? These small little stupid states, or quote unquote whole countries, right? As Trump said in his first term, are piddling. They really mean nothing, right? They're not even united, they're fragmented and so on. So we can do what we want. We can threaten this one here, threaten that one there. But if you're consolidated, it's not so easy, right? But okay, we threaten trade access, we threaten their financial systems, because a lot of our people are invested there. We threaten sanctions, we threaten visa regimes and security arrangements. All of these things were threatened in the region. actively threatened. And this is what I mean about maximum pressure from Marco Rubio, who's one of the chief advisors of President Trump's foreign policy position in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean. And so this influence is gradual, right? The pressure is accumulating. Alignment is expected, because if you don't align, we're going to impose this maximum pressure on you. So that your neutrality, as you spoke about Gaston Brown's market shift, that neutrality becomes harder to sustain, because your sovereignty is up for grabs, because these are the things that you rely upon to make your economy function. But you can't rely on it again, because this chief investor, this chief person that has a lot of resources invested into your country, because we're so fragmented, because we're not a political and economic union, we're operating in silos despite being part of a face value body. But in the absence of being truly integrated within the context of the Caribbean single market and economy, with one monetary policy, one political system, we could offset those threats, right? So that we're not responding to challenges in silos, right? And so, this is the reality that we're facing.
Well, I fully concur with you. What I would say is that we have, as I have to start, we have to start winding up, and we have to have a part two of this, or a continuation of this conversation. What I would say is that Marcus Garvey was one of the greatest leaders in the world, and definitely greatest leader for Black people, right? He said two things. Well, one thing he said is Black people ain't gonna know themselves until their backs up against the wall, right? That's number one. Number two, Bob Marley said sometimes it seems like sudden destruction is the only solution. So we've witnessed in the last couple months that all it takes is Trump saying one little thing on Truth Media or whatever, Truth Social, and you get certain Caribbean leaders jumping in line, right? They may say one thing publicly, but behind the scenes, they're now doing something else, right? And what happens in that respect is that the people of the country start to realize, well, if my prime minister had to fall in line, I have to fall in line. The same way your prime minister had to say it to, well, behave on yourself, else you're not going to get to go to America, right? We have to, our generation, right? Those of us who are educated, those of us who have our own personal finances in order, those of us who have the willpower have to continue the conversation of how we become a greater political and economic union, right? Because when you look at what the Caribbean has produced, are you hearing me?
Yeah, I'm hearing you. Just got a bit of
okay. When you see what the Caribbean has produced pound for pound, we are one of the greatest regions in the world. We've survived genocide. We survived hundreds of years of slavery. We survived hurricanes, right? We can survive this only if we have the willpower and if we actually work together.
Correct.
Right? That is therein lies the problem. All it takes is one little person, shouldn't say little person, but one person to say one thing, and we start bickering amongst ourselves about the small little things because we're thinking back to that myopic. How can I protect my country? How can I defend my country? And in defending your country, you are letting down the region, right? So I would that's what I would say.
Look, I would conclude by saying this, because I'm mindful that we have to wrap up, right? I'll conclude by saying this. Colonialism, in my view, never really left the Caribbean region, right? It changed from power now, moving through to finance, aviation, insurance, and security arrangements. That is just like how things have changed and evolved, right? And so when we're looking at, Bermuda as a British overseas territory, and Trinidad as like an anchor that sits within that, a regional economic anchor that sits within that system. You know, when these tensions are rising and all sorts of decisions are being made externally, we can't really opt out of it, right? Because we're part and parcel of it, right? So we experience the consequences of these actions, whether we are directly involved or not. Now, there's some of us, some of the larger states with more resources and stuff like that. We can navigate away from these things, but then it's whether we have the political will to do so properly, right? And why what you said is so important is that collectively as a region, and in particular speaking to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, together, because we're a cosmopolitan society, all sorts of different people, we need to understand that we built, we managed, we walked together, we marched together through thick and thin against imperialism. The same imperialism that had our East Indian brothers and sisters in sugarcane farms, right, working during the indentured laborship. Right, we marched because our African brothers and sisters in the region were forced for labor. The Chinese persons were brought here, right, to do all sorts of different things, right? The Syrian Lebanese fleeing persecution, okay, and all of us have connected together and tried to build ourselves. And thanks to people like Dr. Eric Williams and the policies of our ancestors, these things have contributed to where we are. We're not perfect, we're not there just yet, but you're absolutely right. We have a moment right now to take the decisions for the future that will benefit all of us. And that decision has to now look at removing those barriers, removing those mentalities, and really, breaking those chains to be a region that is ready to face the challenges of the 21st century.
Yeah, and I mean, we have to be grateful for things such as the internet and social media that, when properly employed, we can have these conversations amongst ourselves and with our people, right? Because
Absolutely.
I want to apologize because I failed to mention that this show is also, the recording is going to be broadcast in Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos Islands, and both the U.S. and British Virgin Islands through Cayman Mauru, Radio Turks and Caicos Islands, CBN radio and TV in the Virgin Islands, and Channel 82 in Bermuda. Of course, we're online. But I say that in the sense to say that, listen, we have a choice, right? Those of us are 30, 40, 50 years old, we can make money and spend it on Amazon, have a nice house, or
Mhm.
and take trips to Paris, wherever, or we
Mhm.
can take some of that money and build up ourselves and our not our economies, right? Because when we look in islands that are tourist have tourist economies, everybody's relying on somebody to come in and invest in a hotel.
Mhm.
What happens when they build that hotel? When they build that hotel, when they build that hotel, most of that money gets goods, goods, goods out of the island, right?
Mhm.
Yes, it creates some jobs, but
Mhm.
most of the money goes out of the island, right? So
Correct.
if you built a hotel yourself, right, maybe that money, bigger proportion stays in the country, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So I say these things that we have. First of all, you have to be brave enough to do these things. If you don't have the testis, testicular fortitude to think that way and act that way, it's already a
Mhm.
loss. Trump has already won. Colonialism has already won.
Correct. Absolutely.
So,
I concur.
as I said, I want to thank you. The show is normally 1 hour, but we had to go over with the amount of stuff that's happened recently. But we
Mhm.
must have you back on to continue this conversation, not just about current happenings, but how do we move towards the future.
Indeed. Indeed.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to your listening audience. I see our numbers have gone up, our live numbers have gone up. Thank you to those tuning in through Pearce Robinson's Facebook page, Territory Talks Facebook page. Thank you to my sister who is avid. Rosalind is in the Dutch rest business right now. And again, thank you to my co-host, Shanna Smith Archer in the beautiful Virgin Islands, and speaker Shirley Osborne of Montserrat. Um, I think we might have ourselves a new co-host. Nevertheless, we will continue this conversation, as I'm quite sure things will be continuing to be happening in the region that we must bring to the light, bring to the people.
Indeed. Thank
All
you very
right.
much. Take care.